Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person and also on Zoom. It's a fairly full room in person, at least on this one side. And on Zoom, we have over 60 people joining in as well. So thank you for staying and joining the session on education. I'm Arushi Thurve. I work at NORAG as the thematic lead for private sector approaches, and all of our innovative financing research falls under that thematic area. So we designed this session pretty much around the discussion we were having this morning on collaborations on learning itself. So that was very much about collaborations and implementation, problem solving. We're taking it forward on learning within the education sector for outcomes-based financing. So we have esteemed panelists here with us, and we have 3 panelists online as well. All of our speakers have extensive experience in the education sector in experimenting with innovative financing models, especially in outcomes-based financing, creating innovation for implementation of interventions in education, and also research and collaborative research with different stakeholders in this area. So we really wanted to bring everyone together to start thinking about the opportunities and challenges we face in doing collaborative learning. Outcomes-based financing pretty much requires collaboration between different actors, but these actors don't work in silos. They do need to learn together and create a common knowledge base to move this field forward itself. So any kind of collaborative learning does require diverse knowledge base and perspectives. So that's what we are hoping to provide you with today. So we will start with very short presentations from our speakers on what they are doing in education and in this area on outcomes-based financing, and a little bit of discussion on their collaborative learning process. And then I will take the privilege of being a chair and have a really long list of questions for all of them. So I will be the one asking questions first, but we do hope to leave 15 to 10 minutes at the end for audience questions, both from Zoom and in person. So please, throughout the conversation, if anything is sparking your interest, take notes and get ready to ask those questions, and then also catch them during lunch to ask additional questions. So we will start with colleagues from Royal Shakespeare Company. We have Jackie O'Hanlon, who is the Director of Creative Learning and Engagement, Lindsay McCulloch and Matthew Collins, who are both research fellows at Royal Shakespeare Company. So please go ahead, explain what you're doing.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. We didn't set out to engage with outcomes-based finance. What we did was develop a randomized control trial to find out what difference the combination of Shakespeare's language and theatre-based pedagogies made to learning outcomes for children. And we did that because teachers wanted to know what was happening in terms of the changes they could see to children's literacy, particularly in terms of writing and language development, and in terms of children's academic self-concept. So we had kind of 10 years of action research where we were seeing the same themes occur. So we worked with teachers to co-develop a series of measurements that we used in the RCT. And from the results of the RCT, we then collaborated with Nesta on developing an outcomes framework for a 3-year outcomes-based finance pilot that we are just coming to the end of year 1 of. So what Lindsay and Matt are going to do, my colleagues, they're going to explain about the RCT and the measurements, because we think that's really important in terms of understanding the link to the framework that we developed. Lindsay and Matt.
Thank you, Jackie. So just to explain in a bit more detail the project that we ran, it was called Time to Act, and it had 2 main elements. Jackie's referred to the RCT, which was integral to the then development of the outcomes framework that we put together. But it also involved the curation or convening of a teacher researcher network, which was a much more qualitative part of the project. And actually the 2 in tandem really created a positive co-creative environment in which we could co-design those research questions and ultimately those research measures that have ended up in our outcomes framework. So just a little bit of detail on the RCT though. We worked with 45 schools across England, state-maintained schools, all with above average percentage of free school meal pupils. We worked specifically with year 5, which in England is years sort of 9 to 10-year-olds. And what we did, we had all these classes, we randomized them. I'm sure you know about RCTs, but we randomized them into 2 groups, intervention and control. Our intervention teachers, they came to Stratford-upon-Avon. They learned how to use our teaching approaches. So if you don't know, we have worked in education for a long time, encouraging teachers to get students away from their desks, up on their feet, acting out parts, embodying language, and from Shakespeare's plays specifically. So we trained teachers in those approaches, and they delivered our intervention, which was 20 hours teaching of this kind across spring and summer terms last year. It was last year, wasn't it? And our control group just delivered their existing curriculum. And we, of course, tested both these groups before and after the intervention. And Matt's going to tell you about the results of that.
Yeah, so just a very quick summary of the results. We can circulate a link to the fuller report if you're interested in seeing the detail. But the challenge that we faced was really thinking about the impact. How do we measure impact with greater specificity and clarity? As Jackie mentioned, we have lots of anecdotal research, case studies, but how might we think about quantifying some of that evidence and then being able to broker conversations with things like outcomes-based finance and donors, etc. So there was a challenge, and the way we approached that challenge was really think about mixed methods. And that was mixed both in the traditional sense of qualitative and quantitative, mixing those and triangulating the results from those different types of research, but also mixed in terms of validated and innovative tools. We know that actually, in terms of the maturity of the evidence base for arts-based interventions, there's a lot of work to do in terms of understanding how we make those how those measures measure that impact with any sort of greater clarity. So it gave us an opportunity to think about what are the ways in which we can most sensitively think about the desired impacts that these programs have. Just to talk very briefly about some of the results. So the first thing we did was to develop a writing measure. And essentially what we got pupils to do was respond to active approaches and then, assuming the role of a Shakespeare character, write a kind of SOS letter from a desert island. We did that as part of the RCT. We did that in the control group as well as the target group. And what we did was fed all of that corpus of, it was about 1,000 responses. We've got 130,000 word corpus that we're able to put through linguistic software and do some quantitative analysis on vocabulary and syntax structure. And what we saw was greater depth, complexity and length, sophistication in terms of that language usage, in terms of the mechanics of language. But also semantically, we were able to do a kind of analysis looking at those 2 groups. What we saw were distinct topic selection, distinct use of different types of vocabulary. In the target group, for example, we saw indications of using much more emotional language and much more kind of resilience and optimism, and indicators there of sort of very different sort of topic choices when it came to those 2 groups. So really interesting kind of linguistic analysis there. Jackie also mentioned academic self-concept is something that we wanted to look at, and we used a validated tool, Myself as a Learner, which some of you may have come across. It's a sort of Likert scale questionnaire that pupils fill in themselves, so self-report measure. And what we saw there were greater impacts both between intervention and control group and between pre and post testing with regards to feelings of ability, and how pupils encountered difficult work. And our working proposition with that is that Shakespeare, and particularly the complexity of Shakespeare, if you can get Shakespeare, you can get anything. That actually in overcoming and sort of being able to get Shakespeare at whatever age group, that instills a certain level of confidence with regards to approaching schoolwork more generally. And then finally, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, think about the teacher research network. So we convened a research network of 14 teachers who are experienced in delivering the pedagogy, and they developed their own individual research projects that looked at how this impacts pupils depending on the intervention and the exercises that are used, those rehearsal room approaches, depending on sort of demographic factors. So looking at how Shakespeare is used to teach English as a second language, as well as how it can be flexed for special educational needs, how it impacts pupils with dyslexia, etc. And that convening of a teacher researcher network was really a way of formalising and allowing us to have conversations with a community of practice, and thinking about the ways in which we can better understand the classroom, what's happening in the classroom, and giving teachers themselves an opportunity to be researchers and participate in thinking about the measures that are most appropriate in this environment.
Thank you. That was really interesting to hear on a very different approach to education, but still getting to very similar goals that other traditional education projects get to. Next, we have Dhir Chingran, who is the Executive Director and founder of Language and Learning Foundation in India. He's joining us from India. Dhir, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you just go to the next slide, please? Language and Learning Foundation collaborates with governments in India to improve foundational learning outcomes of children at scale. The route to achieving that, of course, is to transform teaching and learning practices across tens and thousands of classrooms. We not only work with governments, but we also focus on the strengthening of the system, which is the focus of all the programs that we do. Next, please. We've been working on outcome-based financing projects or impact financing projects since 2019. As you see the list here, it's a total investment of about $10 million, of course, until 2026-27, and about 1.5 million children for whose learning we would be accountable. The model of assessment is usually a quasi-experimental design with control and treatment, a difference in difference approach with defined effect sizes. For example, for this project, which is called LT1, which the British Asian Trust had curated, there is an agreement of a 0.35 standard deviation for grades 1 to 3. Couple of projects also look at benchmarks and what, for example, what proportion of kids, let's say 60% kids, are going to be reading at an oral reading fluency rate of 40 words per minute or more. So that's also another way of looking at outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, improving student learning outcomes is, of course, the most important component of these outcome financing, outcome-based projects, but also system strengthening, which has been integrated as an outcome that is measured and also included in the payouts. Next, please. The first bond that we did, it wasn't really an impact bond, though it was called that. It was a simple risk guarantee mechanism in the state of Haryana, where there were outcome funders. These are corporate sector funders who went into an agreement for 3 years with us as the service provider. And there was, of course, an outcome evaluator. There was a convener for the bond. But the most important part of this arrangement was that there was a risk investor or a risk guarantor who committed to pay to the outcome funders in case the performance of the service provider was not up to the targets that were decided. And this was a sliding scale. So depending on what was achieved, there was a kind of compensation or penalty to be paid. Of course, that never was not required to be operated because the bond performed very well. There was a final effect size of all competencies together of almost 0.67. This was the first bond with a risk guarantee model. Next, please. And the one other example, on this one, since we are very system focused, as the bond was coming to an end, we were already in discussion with the state government to extend that model to the entire state. And today we work as a coalition with other partners to support foundation learning in the entire state of Haryana in about 8,600 schools. So in a way, the impact of the bond was to scale it up to the entire state. Next, please. Just one more example of the current bond, which is the LT1 bond, which is more a traditional impact kind of bond, where there is a risk investors who then provide funds on an ongoing basis, working capital to the implementation partners. There's a performance evaluation, verification of the outcomes, and then the funders who are corporate sector as well as organizations like MSDF then provide investment and returns to the risk investors. So that's the other model we are working on. Next, please. And just one more point here, that we have always tried to remain engaged in the design of the process, assessments, evaluations, etc. Initially, we were told that we should keep away from outcomes and evaluation. That's not the implementation partner's role. But it is really quite important. And as you see on this slide, apart from haggling for effect size targets, I think we engaged quite effectively with the consortium to say that you can't achieve learning outcomes in year one, and therefore year one became a learning year where there was no expectation of student learning outcome improvements. And also in terms of including system strengthening indicators as part of the payouts along with student learning outcomes, which is quite rare for an impact bond, but this particular bond includes that. And I'll end with this last slide, please. We have always looked at collaborative learning as a part of all our outcome-based funding projects, whether it is monthly, quarterly meetings within the program, all the stakeholders within the particular project, research through agencies like TIS, NORAG, and ISDM, learning engagement across consortium partners on a regular basis, cross-sharing, and then, of course, sharing data and learning with the governments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dheer. That was a very good explanation of all the different outcomes funding that you're involved in and how you're engaging in collaborative learning, not just in a matter of research engagement, but also with day-to-day monthly meetings with all the stakeholders. Next, we will go to Dr. Vikas Manyar, who's an associate professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And I have to say, we partner with them to conduct a lot of the research in this area. So Vikas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Arushi. I would focus, as you would guess, on a researcher's perspective on research collaborations. As a partner to the IFE project, we have been involved in researching quite a few outcome-based programs across the globe, primarily in the Global South. So my focus would be on what are the kind of things that are emerging from our understanding of these projects. Next, please. So, of course, the promise of IFE or innovative finance is that financial innovations will trigger management innovations and educational innovations, and which would then make things faster, better, cheaper as they were, right? More effective, more efficient, and of course, more inclusive. And all of this in the long run would lead to a much greater accountability in public spending, build systems capacities, as Dheer just mentioned, of not just improving learning outcomes, but handling contracts which are complex, or even capacities to scale and sustain educational innovations. And finally, the impact of additionality, not just in terms of funding and funders, but also in terms of large number of beneficiaries, which are typically hard to reach. There's a big problem, as we all know. Education remains underfunded, and we need to kind of figure out ways of having more money flowing into education. So of course, why do we need to research something like this? Is because it is emerging. It's still a lot of it is unknown, still being understood, and researching innovative finance projects and programs in education would get us a better understanding of these projects, would reduce risks perceived because of information gaps, and help us design better models, both and implement much better projects. Next, please. Right. So, what could be the research agenda for something like this? We see it as a three-pronged kind of an agenda. One is primarily conceptual, where we need to focus on building a conceptual vocabulary, a conceptual toolkit to make sense of a complex endeavor as this. And it's complex because it is multidisciplinary by design. You need to be engaged in not just education research, but you should be familiar with management finance, public policy and such, and you have to kind of bring those insights together. And we need conceptual vocabulary to kind of being able to handle that. We need models that would allow us to make sense of these programs. The second is to test the promise, which is essentially working with projects. That's what we do primarily at TIS in IFEL and OB projects, is to work with projects and figure out what works and under what conditions, right? I mean, we know what educational goals are. This is a very new way of achieving those goals. And so it's important for us to kind of spend time trying to understand what's working and what conditions. And the third one is, also, of course, to learn from successes and failures, mostly through case studies of what's already happened. Yeah, we can go to the next. So these are some of the examples of the kind of projects that we are engaged in. They're at various stages. Some of them are already in public domain. The research is in public domain. Some of them are starting. And so, yeah, next, please. So from our experience, there are quite a few issues that are emerging in innovative finance. And we all know these, right? The foremost is, for example, the promise that financial innovation will trigger management innovation and educational innovation. Is it actually happening? Our experience would say management innovations, yes. Educational innovations, not so much. Similarly, there are issues about, how do we measure outcomes? How do we set targets? How do we set pricing? And this has serious impact on fair returns to the risks that both reputational and financial risks that various stakeholders are taking. And then there are questions around, hey, these, the enabling services like outcomes measurement itself it's quite expensive, and does it kind of feed in? Does it, the efficiency of the program, does it cover for that kind of cost? So there are multiple questions that are emerging from these early engagements that we need to address, we need to research, and hopefully through research we'll be able to find better answers, better models that we can apply in the future. Next. Yeah, I mean, as I'd mentioned already, researching this is complex because not only is it multidisciplinary, it requires partnerships, collaborative partnerships with various stakeholders, because you want to work in live projects is where that's when you can understand what's working and what's not working. And these kind of collaborations bring quite a few issues to fore. I mean, you're looking at accessing sensitive data. You're looking at building trust that you would not you would use only this information for the purposes of research and feeding into the bettering of these models. And so some of these issues or some of these challenges that we have to deal with in researching these programs. So I mean, next, please. In some, this is a very promising area of research for educational researchers. It's a new way of achieving educational goals, but it's also challenging in the sense that it requires you to reimagine yourself, both in terms of capacities, your conceptual vocabulary, your models, and then do research in a collaborative manner, which serves mutual interest, right? If as a researcher, you're just going on with questions that don't build a common ground with all the stakeholders, then it becomes difficult to research such issues. So it's quite a challenging area, but a very, very promising area for an education researcher, both to learn from and contribute to. Thank you.
Vikas, and thanks for bringing up the point that it is a very challenging area to research, to bring everyone together with a common understanding. But at the same time, as researchers, we are very excited about this opportunity because these are not partnerships we normally engage in. I will next go to Sietse, who has been working on this ecosystem for a very long time now. So Sietse is the Program Director for Innovative Financing at UBS Optimus Foundation. Would love to hear from you on your perspective from Optimus Foundation.
Thank you, Arushi. And can we move to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah, so I actually don't come from an education background, but more from a practitioner background where we've done a number of outcome-based financing programs where we've funded them, we've invested in them. Just quickly about the UBS Optimus Foundation, most of you might know us, but just in case, we're an independent foundation set up by UBS 25 years ago. We actually have our anniversary this year. And we are funded by client donations, so we don't have an endowment. So we have annual funding that we then grant out or invest. And investing is something we've started doing since 2015 with the Educate Girls Impact Bond in India. And we've moved that on to bigger investments, and we've also started to do direct investments in social enterprises. Focus areas are education, health, the environment, and maybe not to dwell too long on this slide, but maybe just good to mention an area that we're increasingly looking at as well within education is employment. Can we move to the next slide? So outcome-based financing is something we've been engaged in since 2015 with the Educate Girls Impact Bond, and we really like the approach of shifting from inputs, activities to outcomes. And we saw really strong results in that, and that encouraged us to continue funding in the space. We funded the Utkrist Impact Bond in health in India, the QEI Impact Bond in India, and have been able to move that on into setting up a $100 million investment fund together with Bridges Outcomes Partnership to invest in up to 20 impact bonds. And the goal that we have there is really to try and move investments in outcomes-based finance programs if they're needed. And I emphasize that if they're needed. I don't think investments are always needed, so I think it's an optional layer that should be built in. But to move that really to commercial investing, to take ourselves as a foundation out of the equation, because we should not, as a foundation, be an investor in the long run. We should be catalyzing programs to be commercially supported. And we do that as well in our direct investments in social enterprises. The approach we have is threefold. We do education, ecosystem support, so that's from research to the Outcomes Accelerator, which you might have heard of, to direct investments, which, for example, we did in the Utkrist bond and the QEI bond, to then blended finance structures, such as the program we're now doing with Bridges. Go to the next slide. So, outcome-based financing, where can we move from here? How can we take this experience that we've gathered in the foundation and move onwards? We live in a really complex world, and there is actually, in many cases, although we always talk about this, the SDGs, that we need more money, but in reality, there's probably not going to be more money because there's going to be the next conflict. Now we see huge issues, of course, in the Middle East. It's unlikely we're going to see huge sums suddenly appear. So we need to get better results. And OBF is one of those approaches which we really strongly believe can really help in that. We see really strong results from the earlier outcomes-based funding programs, and we really think that shows that this is an approach that can work in the right context. Of course, there are perceptions that it's complex and it takes overly long, and that's something I think we need to address and need to think about as a space and how we can do that and how we can support the narrative of this shift to paying for outcomes. I think for that, a couple of things we think are really important to keep in mind is that transparency, the accountability, flexibility, but also this continuous improvement is super important for that. And that is actually, it's more a cultural change. And in outcomes contracts are not 2-3 year programs. They're more a cultural change program with continuous improvement that continues. You measure, fail, succeed, repeat. And that's something I think we don't talk about often enough. I also think collaboration is really important, but at the end of the day, funders are in the lead, and we should be there to support them. And collaboration there is supportive and really should help, to drive down costs, to ensure that we have a really steep learning curve, we share data, and we continue to do better all the time. And I think education is I just want to end there, the area I think that we have the most experience in OBF in general. We have really good measurements, we have really good baselines, and we're really starting to see how we can use this approach to get better and better results, particularly in education. We're starting to take that knowledge to other areas such as health, climate, etc. But I do think that in education is the area where we have most of the experience.
Okay, thank you, Sietse, and thanks for pointing out that the point of research and collaborative learning here is to learn from both successes and failures and continually improve. It's not for journal articles and just for people to read, but actually to apply it within the field. I am going to invite Ozel Bilali from Education Outcomes Fund. She's the head of learning and engagement in early childhood care and education. Ozel is joining us from Washington, D.C. today. They have been engaged in a lot of collaborative learning activities. So Ozel, it would be great for you to explain what you're doing there at Education Outcomes Fund.
Thank you, Rushi, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I only wish I could be there in person today. So maybe to give some context to EOF's engagement in collaborative learning, I'll start by giving a bit of a background about EOF itself and our work to date in early childhood care and education. But I will not limit my reflections to our collaborative learning efforts, if that's okay. I'll also touch on our internal learning journey. In fact, I will argue that for program-anchored organizations like EOF, figuring out how to learn effectively internally while doing the work goes hand in hand with engaging in collaborative learning with others in the ecosystem. So next slide, please. As some of you may already know, EOF is a global fund hosted under UNICEF with the mandate to champion outcomes-based financing for education. We do this primarily by building outcomes partnerships under government stewardship in low and middle income countries. So today I will be focusing on our work in early childhood care and education, that's ECCE, and you'll hear this acronym quite a bit in my presentation. But we do work in other sectors, including basic education and skills for employment. So ECC is one of the core sectors highlighted in our founding charter, but it was only in 2022 when we partnered with the Lego Foundation that we were able to intensify our efforts in this sector. And we have since facilitated the building of outcomes partnerships for ECC in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. And over the past year, our program teams have been working hard with our government partners on the design of 3 outcomes funds. In this slide, I highlighted 4 of the many design puzzles that kept our colleagues awake at night: the measurement puzzle, the attribution puzzle, the target setting puzzle, and the pricing puzzle. And for those of you who've been involved in designing impact bonds or outcomes funds, these puzzles probably sound very familiar. But I suspect that those of you who've designed OBF programs in ECCE would agree that figuring these puzzles out is particularly tricky for ECCE. So very much parallel to EOF's design work, we also started reaching out to others in the OBF ecosystem to learn from their experiences. And several of you in the audience today generously shared your time and wisdom with us in this early phase. And it was through these conversations that we thought there could be value in facilitating more of this peer-to-peer learning in this sector. In fact, I remember one particular conversation in a hotel lobby in Tashkent with Jessica Brown from UNICEF. I'm not sure if she was able to join online today, but We were at the World Conference at ECCE, and she talked about the experiences in Namibia and Uzbekistan with OBF programs for ACCE. And it seemed that there was a loss of momentum and interest after the first wave of OBF programs in ECCE. Several of them were canceled. Others raised some negative public reaction. So we thought, is there a way that we could build on these experiences by surfacing the learnings from this first wave in a way to create momentum for a more successful second wave of programs? And it was this question that gave birth to our partnership with GoLab, NORAC, and ECRIS for a collective learning initiative focused on OBF for ACCE, and also to our partnership with the Education Finance Network for a learning group on outcomes-based financing in education, where some of our focus was on ACCE. So before I share about these two collaborative learning efforts quickly, I'd like to talk a bit more about our own internal learning journey. So next slide, please. And so while there's been several impact bonds for ECC, to my knowledge, the ECC outcomes funds to be launched in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and South Africa are the first outcomes funds dedicated solely to ECCE. Maybe for the sake of time, I'll skip the discussion on these 4 puzzles, but just to say, we will be publishing a series of briefs summarizing our learnings from our attempt at tackling these puzzles. So keep an eye out for them in the coming months. Next slide, please. But a small reflection on our internal learning journey, and this is in case there are those of you who work in similarly program-anchored organizations in the OBF space. So during the design process, we quickly came to realize that doing does not necessarily translate to learning as an organization. So as an organization, we increasingly started engaging in active collective reflection sessions to surface our own learnings and then to convert them to organizational learnings. We also realized that learning across programs, even inside the same organization, doesn't happen automatically. It took us several trials with different collaboration models across teams until we found one that worked for us. In our case, this model was colleagues started working on multiple ECC programs, so across programs, so they could diffuse the learnings from one program to the other. And we created challenge-specific cross-program sprints and teams and dedicated, I think, over 2 months to intensive technical analysis and collective problem solving to tackle these technical challenges jointly with all 3 ECC programs. So just to say, internal learnings and reflective learning, not easy, and they require a lot of thinking also. So now onto our engagements for collaborative learning with others. So next slide, please. Oh, we are on the, no, previous slide. I think we were actually on the, perfect, thank you. So over the past year or so, we had the privilege to partner with networks and organizations with incredible convening power. One of these partnerships was with the Education Finance Network, where we co-chaired a learning group that brought together over about an 8-month period, more than 30 individuals who work at the intersection of outcomes-based financing and education. In 3 of these meetings, we talked about our learnings in outcomes-based financing and education, and including one session that was dedicated to ECCE. The second partnership is one that you're very familiar with, Arushi. We had the privilege of partnering with NORAC, GoLab, and ECRIS to design a process that facilitates the coming together of practitioners with experience at the intersection of OBF and ECCE, so they can surface and share their own learnings. We had the 3rd meeting of this group of amazing individuals yesterday. Dear and Sietse were also there. And I'm very excited for the knowledge resources that will be coming out of this initiative's first few months in the next few weeks, including an evidence review report, 2 case studies, and a practice notes focused on the measurement puzzle. Next slide, please. So what comes next for EOF's learning journey? For our collaborative learning engagements, we look forward to continuing our partnerships in the Collective Learning Initiative. As I said, it's an effort that's very much demand-driven, so we'll continue to build it to respond to the learning priorities of the group's participants. We're also in conversations to see how we can best engage with the broader early childhood development community, so including those who think about health and nutrition in early years. We'd like to put a spotlight on the potential of innovative financing mechanisms for early childhood development, including OBF. And we're hoping we can facilitate kind of the growth of curiosity and learning about OBF in this particular community who focus on early years. And of course, as EOF, we'll continue to reflect, capture, and share our own learnings from the outcomes funds in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. But let me stop here. I think I'm a little bit over 5 minutes, and I look forward to some of the deeper reflections in the next round. Thank you, Rishi.
Thank you, Azel, and thank you for reminding us that there's always a need for internal within organization learning. You can try to engage with other organizations, but unless your team members are doing it within the organization, that absorption may not happen. So thank you for bringing such different perspectives and really showing how different stakeholders are approaching collective learning itself in this field. I have lots of questions and I will try to go through them very quickly. So I would also request our speakers to keep their responses concise and to the point. So first one goes to Lindsay from Royal Shakespeare Company. You mentioned that you've engaged with the teachers in research network with them. I would be interested to know what other stakeholders you've engaged with and what value do you see in engaging with different stakeholders in learning?
Yeah, thank you, Rishi. Yeah, I should say at the outset that, a broad and diverse stakeholder consultation and collaboration is absolutely central to our practice. For our project Time to Act, we convened an expert group, and that consisted of teachers, heads, members of government departments, practitioners, and they were essential to the kind of good decision making that we hopefully made on that project. And certainly from Time to Act into the outcomes framework that we've produced, collaboration was key. So our partners included, yes, absolutely, educational practitioners. There's no way that we could develop the kind of proportionate evidence-based measures and outcomes for an outcomes framework without their input. That was absolutely essential, and I want to emphasize that. But yes, also certainly the arts and cultural sector more widely. So that might include our theatre partners that we have across the country, but also the kind of arts advocacy groups that exist within the UK. So for example, the Cultural Learning Alliance. So, groups that work very much at that interface between education and policy. And they really do understand what kind of outcomes government are looking for. And the initiatives that might best serve those needs. And likewise, we have had discussions with policymakers. So we've had a lot of conversations with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who are themselves very heavily invested in outcomes-based thinking. And we're very heavily invested in influencing policy if we can. So we've had conversations with them about cultural value, including the kind of economic value of culture, and the value of cultural education, and whether a metrics-based approach can actually work, function or malfunction in those contexts. We've talked to innovation agencies, and this is really important for us in terms of our outcomes framework. We collaborated very closely with Nesta, which some of you I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. So the kind of UK's Innovation Agency for Social Good, and their impact team really helped us to develop our outcomes framework. And I guess finally, we have to work closely with our social impact investors, with our donors, especially thinking about it in the context of the arts. So, an outcomes orientation has really given us the means to approach investors that we wouldn't normally approach it as an arts organisation. And those kind of impact-driven investors are quite new to our sector, and they really may prove integral to its future health. We've been talking about, the money's not going up, it's only going down. And we know that in the past few years, donor investment in the arts has gone very steeply down. So even with the change of government, the arts or even arts education is no government's top priority. So we need to diversify our income stream. So we hope that collaborative framework, the adoption of an outcomes framework, will really help us to be at the vanguard of work of this kind within the arts and cultural sector. And just finally, if there's any group that I think we need to engage more with, I think it's actually young people, children and young people themselves. So they are, of course, the object of our research, but they're not necessarily partners in it. And I think that's one area for us to work on, in the same way that we've worked with teacher researchers. I'd like to work with student researchers in the future. So yeah.
Thank you. And showing that diversity and reminding us that ultimately it's the beneficiaries and we do need to be talking to them. Thank you for reminding us of that. As a practitioner, I have the same question for you. You've been doing program implementation for years, not just with outcomes-based financing, but in other ways as well. What would you say is beneficial for your work in doing collaborative learning with other stakeholders?
Right. So we've actually collaborated with stakeholders at all levels, beginning with teachers, the middle tier in the education ecosystem, educational administrators at district, block, state, and national levels. What we found is this, that it helps us in doing a few things. The first, it helps us to actually reflect and review what we are doing and see if there are certain strategies that have limitations that may not be working that well. So it's important to be constantly interacting with all the stakeholders. And if there are materials to be revised, if there's a training program that needs to be tweaked, if there's an assessment that is not serving the purpose, then a constant interaction and engagement with stakeholders is really helpful. We also found that if we have several workshops and training programs, reflective sessions. We also run some courses for our teachers and others. It does help in developing a shared vision of what the change is about and why is it important. It's not just a few practices that are being pushed, but what is the rationale behind this? What are the beliefs that need to change for that? For this, learning engagements are very crucial. Otherwise, it becomes very prescriptive. You decide on a kind of package that is sent out by the government down to the teachers, and there's very limited understanding of why that is happening. It does help us also, as I said earlier, to find out challenges in the design itself, in the way teachers and others are looking at it, or what are the obstacles for adoption, and helps us along with the government, because we co-create everything with government agencies, to sort of iterate on the design in all its aspects based on this constant learning that happens. One of the spin-offs of this constant engagement and collaboration on learning is also, of course, the continuous professional development of people within the education ecosystem, from teachers to state level. The ways of engaging at the state level and with the National Ministry of Education are also, of course, very different. And but what we've seen is that if there is a constant dialogue, if you're able to get close the feedback loop and engage in this kind of learning activities, then the program gets refined and the adoption is also higher. Thank you.
Thank you, Dear, for reminding us there that reflective practices are for organizational learning, but also creating a shared vision between all the stakeholders. Which brings me to the question for Sietse. Optimus Foundation, since the engagement with Educate Girls, has also been heavily involved in shaping the ecosystem of outcomes-based financing. What would you say is the benefit of engaging in research practices and research engagements in shaping that ecosystem itself?
I think it's really important. Coming back to, I mentioned this earlier, we'd like to see more investors come into the space, commercial investors. And the question they always ask is, what's your track record? So we need to develop track record to get these skeptical partners in.
Right.
And doing research provides us with one of the best track records that we can get. And not only for investors, because for outcomes funders as well. Outcome funders are keen to trial and to test, but they do that with their pocket money. They're not doing that with the bigger funding flows because they're actually quite conservative. So by really doing good research, getting that track record, I really see that as a way of being able to get outcome funders to commit much more fundamentally towards funding outcomes. At the same time, I also think it's really important to show the space where not to do outcomes-based financing, because I also think that sometimes maybe we're applying it in the areas where we shouldn't apply it. So I think that's another area where research is really important.
Thanks, and that's resonating with what Vikas was saying earlier on. The purpose of, especially for academic researchers here, is to really show what works, but under what conditions. So it's not necessary that everything can be applied everywhere, and we really need to look at that contextual, and I don't mean just country context, but the actual content of the work itself. So thanks for reminding us of that. Vikas, I'm going to come back to you for the research perspective on that as well. Why do you think us as researchers are engaging in this? What's the benefit for us? And then what advice would you give to other researchers when engaging in collaborative practices, especially when we are engaging with practitioners, investors, funders in this area?
Right. For education researchers, the benefits are obvious. Outcome-based funding is the way things are going. It is also very promising in the sense that it would address issues of funding gap in education, but also effectiveness of fund deployment, right? And so education researchers need to be engaged with this kind of research that's happening right now. And collaboration is the way to go for this, because it is happening, it's emerging, it's happening as we speak. There is not a lot of literature to go back to. You have to kind of generate insights from projects, from ab initio, from implementations, and collaborations are a way to go. Working with partners, with real projects, live projects that are happening, and that's how you would build these insights. And it challenges education researchers in a sense that we've been very inward focused, looking at how to do better pedagogy or that kind of stuff. But now it challenges us to look at how do external influences impact education, and that's a very exciting place for us to be, for education researchers to be. And of course, not just learning from all this, but contributing to the pragmatic concerns of what works, because end of the day, we are all interested in making education work particularly for the hard to reach marginalized populations, right? So in many ways, it becomes very exciting. What should researchers do while collaborating? I think first is to find common ground, because you would have partnerships only when your interests align. They may not be the same interests, but everyone should be able to get something out of these researchers, and be very sensitive to the partners' conditions. We have access to very sensitive data that needs to be handled with extreme care. We need to be careful about demanding too much time and effort from people who are already overworked in implementation and such. So be sensitive to your partners. And I think finally be open and challenge yourself, challenge your own positions and your own prejudgments about how things are done. And just focus on this whole idea of what you just said, what works under what conditions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. And I resonate with Vikas on this, challenging our own preconceived notions of how things work and really talking to partners. It really opens up our eyes on what realities exist within a context. Ozel, since you presented on how you have been engaged in very structured collaborative learning, what I would like to learn from you is what you believe are the key success or enabling factors to make collaborative learning happen. And then I'll add the second question along with that on what are the biggest obstacles in making that collaborative learning happen.
Thank you, Rushi. So as you said, in our case, we think about collaborative learning in the OBF ecosystem that that's about peer-to-peer learning amongst OBF practitioners and experts. So in this case, I think there has to be an unsolved puzzle, a tricky challenge that keeps practitioners awake at night, and that motivates them to put aside time to hear from others on how they went about trying to solve this puzzle. Luckily, in our case, with using OBF in ECC, there's several of these unsolved puzzles, so that's not a binding constraint. But in any case, I think identifying one or more of these unsolved puzzles and putting them at the heart of the collaborative learning process is important for feeding curiosity and keeping the desire from learning others alive. And I think there's a beautiful energy that comes from this collective puzzling of experts and practitioners coming together. I also think there are some secret ingredients to thriving collaborative learning processes. For example, goodwill and trust are two of these ingredients. If they already exist among the participants, that's an amazing asset to work with and to build on. If they don't exist, there's a lot of steps to prepare the grounds to build that goodwill and trust. And for those of you who've played the role of a convener for collaborative learning, I think we have a lot to learn from those who've been thinking about what Priya Parker calls the art of gathering. I don't know if any of you came across Priya's book. It's titled The Art of Gathering. It was published a few years ago. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. In her book, she puts forward some key principles for crafting meaningful and impactful gatherings. She talks about the importance of defining a clear purpose, both for the group, but also for each gathering itself. She talks about the importance of curating an invitation list and the important decisions around who to invite and who not to invite. She highlights the value of creating a distinct experience for a group that establishes an engaging environment, so people keep on coming back to these environments. And Priya's book had been very much of a guidance when colleagues from education finance networks and us came together to design the innovative education finance learning group. And at least for UF and myself, I can say that we're very new to this role of convening. So we've been trying hard to practice and learn, and with each meeting to design the next one better for collaborative learning. But if I may come back to trust here, partly because some of my earlier academic work examines the role of trust in learning about and adopting new policy models. I think trust is an essential ingredient to collaborative learning. It's trust in the expertise, the competence of others in the group. So you believe in the value of the learnings that they share. Is trust in the goodwill, the benevolence of others in the group. So you can openly share without feeling that you might be making yourself or your organization vulnerable. So as conveners, as practitioners, the challenge we have for ourselves, I think, is how do we grow this sense of trust as an enabling factor for collaborative learning in our community of practitioners who use outcomes-based financing in education? And to the other side of your question on key challenges, these are a bit more practical, and I would say time, space, and money. So time, not only because everyone is really busy and there's so many competing demands, but I think just purely time zones, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, as a global community that's spread across the world, yesterday we had colleagues join at 11 p.m. their time, and one colleague was going to try to join 4 a.m. his time in the South Pacific, but last minute couldn't. So building a community of practitioners, I think, just faces this very natural challenge. And I think connecting to this is space. While the fact that we can come together on the screen is a blessing for a global community of practitioners, I think it's also never the same as coming together in person. And this is coming from someone who's feeling a strong sense of envy for all of you who are in Oxford today and enjoying each other's company. So I think, but most importantly, the biggest challenge, I think, is money. Convening is a time-intensive endeavor, and someone needs to fund it. So as EOF, we have the good fortune of partnering with a funder, the Lego Foundation in this case, who shares our vision about the importance of investing in the ecosystem. But this is not always the case. We need for funders to think about how to complement their program funding with funding that builds a stronger ecosystem that's also well connected and where learnings diffuse rapidly. I think, as Shetz rightly pointed out, I think there is collaboration drives down costs ultimately, so we can all achieve steeper learning curves. So we can share our experiences and we can share data and others. So we need more funders to come into this space and think about this. But I'll stop there. And very happy to take questions on this topic, but especially on trust, if anyone would like to talk about that.
Yes, and thanks, Azel, for bringing up the goodwill part and putting it together with the funding. So even when individuals are getting paid to participate in a collaborative learning process, it is their goodwill and benevolence on actually fully engaging, sharing their information. I think we take it for granted a lot of times that people will just come and share, and it's not such an easy process from the perspective of sharing or from the perspective of getting people to share. And funding is absolutely required. It cannot be just something that you do always within your projects. With that, with Royal Shakespeare Company, I do want to get your perspective on what you think has worked well in keeping the momentum going for practitioners who are so busy in their work to engage in collaborative learning. So Jackie, I'll come to you for that.
Thank you. I mean, I would say that at the heart of, even before we were engaged with outcomes-based finance deliberations and the pilot that we're in, the heart of the pedagogy that we are exploring with teachers is it's about the relationship between learning and doing. But the puzzle at the heart of it, you know, using Azel's language, we're asking teachers to be engaged in a critical inquiry with us. And that critical inquiry is, what difference does the work of, in our case, you know, our house playwright, William Shakespeare, and a theatre-based pedagogy, what difference does that make to learning outcomes for children? Which children most benefit from that work and that way of working? And in what ways do they benefit? Why? So those questions and the specificity of the answers are drivers for the work, irrespective of whether you've got an outcomes-based finance framework attached to it or not. So I suppose it's about the authenticity of what's driving the questions coming out of the pedagogy. And I think the other thing in the UK, certainly, from an arts education perspective, these are very under-researched areas. There is not a big body of research to draw on from the UK. We look to other territories, other countries, where there are much more large-scale pieces of research that have been undertaken. So the answers feel really important as well. And what you know, all of us have talked about, and certainly what's at the heart of our work, is a community of research and practice. And that combination, certainly for the teachers, has been a very a really significant part of their professional learning. So teachers will talk about the change in their identity because we are inviting that critical inquiry about what is changing in the classrooms. It's very important for us as an arts organisation that we know the work that we are creating. I remember a head teacher saying to me, you know, years ago, you know, lovely work, great work, but the reason we keep doing it is because it has an impact on learning outcomes. That's what matters to us. Now, the minute I see as an arts organisation, we aren't making that impact, you know, we need to make some radically different changes. So we're all, it's really important for us that we're evidencing that difference and that we're working with teachers on that. And it's really important for teachers that we're inviting them to be part of that critical inquiry. All of that has enabled us to then build an outcomes framework that is genuinely meaningful for the teacher, as well as for a philanthropist. If it is only impactful for the philanthropist, it will not work.
And I think you're also giving that meat to what Ozel said, that it has to be a problem that's keeping them up at night, right? So that will keep the momentum. They need to keep solving that problem. And I hope they solve one and then come to the next problem and the next step, and that's how they're getting engaged. Here, you've participated in a lot of different communities of practices, learning opportunities within the Indian context and globally. What have you seen as something that has worked well, especially to get practitioners engaged outside of formal meetings and events? We come together in these types of events, but there is something that needs to happen in between as well. What do you think works there? And then what's the biggest obstacle for practitioners to actually engage?
Yeah, thanks, Arushi. We've tried quite a few collaborative learning opportunities with communities as well as the entire education ecosystem. We do try and have a lot of reflection in workshops and training programs. We also have communities of practice that have not been very easy to sustain, but there have been a part of the teachers and the others in the system who have continued for some time, who are motivated. We also do joint field visits and classroom observations with people in the education ecosystem, so that there is a shared understanding of what needs to change, what is happening. There are several national networks that a couple of them we have curated, some others that we have joined to share learning in the entire sector. We also, and I'm talking about right now about what happens in a project, let's say at the district level. A district is about 1,500 schools. Also trying to celebrate the achievements of good teachers, share their best practices in, say, monthly meetings that are held, at the block or the cluster level. So a variety of ways in which we try and ensure that there's collaborative learning. There are obstacles, and to say, what Ozel said, several of those points are absolutely right. Many stakeholders are overburdened with several responsibilities. For example, a district education officer in India implements 20 education programs. And then we go to them that foundation learning is very important, but that's only one of the 20 responsibilities the person has. Or a teacher mentor who's working with teachers to provide academic support has to do a lot of data collection and also look at the school accounts, etc. So there are challenges about engaging field staff of the government. There is also, of course, the challenge of not adequate collaborative structures that exist as structures, where people come together on a regular basis to reflect. So sometimes you've got to create those structures, and they don't really take they don't take root so easily. There is, of course, sometimes a resistance to such collaborative learning. Not really resistance, but we are a non-profit, and if we engage with the government on a regular basis, again back to Ozel's point about trust, of whether we are seen as a part of the system, whether they're going to work with us in a very formal manner, or this is going to be a safe space where we are brainstorming about what can be done. So that becomes a constraint itself. In the government system, one of the challenges is also about the value for research and evidence. We always assume that evidence is compelling and we would be able to argue for something if there is research and evaluation evidence available. Often in the government, things work differently. A lot of decisions are taken on a relational basis, right? You have good relationships, and of course, they think an organization is doing a good work. They become more amenable, and they become they would accept ideas more easily. So sometimes research and evidence, which we assume is the most important factor in decision-making within the government is not the case. And the last point, I think, which we think is very important, is that, and I'll speak about OBF projects, it's all about impact measurement. Has student learning improved? There's nothing but data sheets that are presented in the end. The learning is all about those, what were the mean scores, effect sizes, etc. That's it. And the point that Vikas was saying about what worked in which context for whom, that understanding, deep understanding of what were the perceptions of different stakeholders is not available. And often if it is available, it's available a long time later after the project is ended. We make out a case for much more longitudinal research, a more kind of realistic evaluation, which looks at the contexts and all the stakeholders and what is working in that context. Because a lot can be done if such learning was available, because just going with this project has done very well. This is the effect size. It has a limited impact. So we're trying to make out a case for research that is more ongoing around implementation, what works in implementation. And that's very crucial. That will help organizations who are working to implement, to be able to then talk about what worked in the field. Was relationships very important? Why were teachers adopting or not adopting? So I think the one big obstacle also is the lack of such learning that's available for sharing in the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks, Dheer. I do want to switch a little bit more towards the most important piece of outcomes-based financing, measurement. This topic keeps coming up over and over again. It's the biggest puzzle. While Sietse has mentioned that we have really good measurements in education, from the education perspective, we always think we don't have it. So I want to hear from Royal Shakespeare Company. Matthew and Jackie and Lindsay, you've been involved in a very innovative way of creating this measurement from arts education into literacy. Could you share a bit more with us on what lessons you learned on the process of creating that, the success and the challenges you faced?
It really goes back to what Jackie mentioned with regards to participation, and that a lot of the speakers today have been talking about with regards to creating a sort of necessary conditions and environment for collaboration and co-creative research. So we really started from the perspective of thinking of teachers as practitioners, but also as researchers themselves. And that was from the outset of the project, before Lindsay and I started, in thinking about what a research programme at the RSC might look like. Teachers were critical to thinking about formulating those research questions. And just to allude back to something Professor Wood said in the plenary lecture, it's thinking about that kind of approach that is much more trust-based rather than transactional. And those have been kind of key watchwords for us, I think, as we've endeavoured. So to think about that more explicitly, there are kind of three things I'll touch on. These are by no means the only three, but with regards to that identity as the teacher, as researcher, thinking about rigour, relevance and practicality as kind of motivating factors. So firstly, rigour. So I've already mentioned the challenges finding robust measures that are appropriate to these kinds of arts interventions. And teachers were essential in that, in terms of teachers understand, working day in, day out with their pupils, what those impacts are and what those kind of interventions can look like, what's practical in those scenarios as well. So we collaborated very closely with teachers to understand what kind of measures would be appropriate in those contexts. We were able to bring our kind of research expertise, as well as things like access, there's fundamental functional access to libraries and academic research, the literature, understanding what tools are out there. So we were able to sort of work co-creatively with our teacher researchers and our RCT teachers to develop those measures. And we did that, as I say, by adopting validated measures, as well as leaving space for creativity to innovate around measures that we think might be more appropriate for these sort of innovative approaches. And the reason I cite rigour as a kind of key motivating factor is really, there's two things. One, we've had feedback from teachers saying, I can now go to senior leadership, I can now go to parents with, and often quantitative evidence, but more rigorous kind of evidence based on not only the RCT, but our teacher researcher projects, and advocate for the impact that anecdotally I can refer to teachers, but actually when you see it statistically, it seems to have, it certainly widens the sort of the audience for that. But I think there's also something about novelty. Teachers have been really interested in that kind of innovation of tools. And for example, so we took a corpus of children's writing and fed it into linguistic software that told us all sorts of things about grammar and syntax. And that kind of level of engagement in terms of they understand the national curriculum objectives around sort of language development, but to be able to see that actually there are kind of tools out there that can corroborate and look at that in different ways is really attractive and really powerful. The most powerful example of that, I think, is the ways in which those tools are also expansive. They expand beyond formal measures of assessment. So there's a kind of piece of anecdotal evidence that we give regarding a project in Northampton. A teacher there did a teacher researcher project where she looked at pupils' writing. And when we fed those pieces of writing into our linguistic software, the pupil that came out top is a pupil that's been screened for dyslexia and is being assessed as below expectations at year 3 because she doesn't join her handwriting up and she makes spelling mistakes. When you look at the syntactical complexity in terms of the range of vocabulary that she adopts and the kind of narrative structure, the metaphors, it's fascinating to see that a pupil below expectations is actually achieving on different measures far beyond everybody else in that class. So there's something as well about innovation in terms of being expansive, but also being more inclusive. I'll very quickly touch on the other two things. Relevance. So despite that kind of innovative approach to measures, we're also aware that these are measures that have to be relevant. They have to be appropriate to the national curriculum and work within the strictures of what the national conversation is, what policy conversation is, and particularly with an outcomes-based kind of framework, thinking about what is it that's going to resonate with policymakers and donors that is appropriate. And finally, probably the most important one, and particularly the RCT, is this question of practicality. So teacher voice was key to understanding what is practicable in terms of research within a classroom context. We know that teacher capacity is finite and that classroom time is precious. So in terms of the intervention and also the data collection and analysis research activity, we had to be very sensitive and aware of those things. So first of all, one of the things we developed was a teacher journal, and that captures qualitative, anecdotal kind of evidence of teachers observers. Teachers are researchers sort of 9 to 5 in those classrooms because they are forever observing, assessing, thinking about their pupils in research ways. All our teacher researcher journal did was formalise that in a sort of explicit way. And then thinking about what are teachers doing in their practice already with regards to data collection? So we know that schools already collecting lots of demographic information, they're doing formal assessment. How might we use that to triangulate with other measures that we might have? And also thinking about unstructured data. So for example, pupil writing. Pupils are producing reams and reams of text, and that to us is data. So how can those things that are happening in the classroom be brought into scope of kind of research through the most appropriate tools? Practically, what that means is that there's no extra burden to the teacher, but also methodologically, there's something about having something that's unobtrusive, that doesn't feel like, so you sort of avoid observer's paradox and self-report kind of biases, if you like, by having these kind of environments that are the classroom as it would be sort of normally. And I guess those would be three elements that I think probably create a research environment at the heart of which is this teach and this kind of grounded approach to research and thinking about those questions more sensitively. Jackie, I don't know.
Just to say one challenge,
yes,
really quickly. The challenges are many, but one of them is this is so new for the arts sector. So I don't think there's any other arts organisation represented in the conference that I know of. And it's a really contentious issue. The issue of measurement itself is contentious. Should we measure arts impacts, let alone the additional challenge of the question around outcomes-based finance. So we haven't resolved that challenge within the arts and cultural sector. I suppose what I think the outcomes framework work has done is it's given us some teeth in terms of a dialogue we can have with philanthropists in a meaningful way that doesn't compromise our relationship with teachers. Because what matters most to us is really strong and healthy, trusting relationships with our teacher partners, with our schools. So we're trying to, as I say, we're at the end of year 1 of a 3-year pilot. What we're trying to do is find a framework that can really address both needs.
Thank you. I am out of my allocated time for my questions, but I just want to end with one more question for both Özel and Sietse as representing organizations that are supporting the ecosystem itself of outcomes-based financing. If you had to say this in one sentence, what evidence generation at this stage of outcomes-based financing is really needed in one sentence? Sietse first, and then I'll go to Özel.
Oh, wow. I'll maybe counter that. I actually think we have a lot of evidence. We just need to do more programs.
Yep, good program. And then bring that evidence out to people who are not aware of it.
Be open and transparent and share that evidence.
Okay, thank you. Özel.
Arushi, I had 5 minutes to say on this, and
I'm
I will
sorry.
try to bring it down to a single sentence. I heard a lot of people say we need to research if, when, how OBF is better than other ways of financing.
Yeah.
I agree, but I think we need at least, if not more, focus on how we can do OBF better. And I don't think we're using research enough to think about that. We need more experimental approaches to answer some of these questions. We need more quasi-experimental approaches to answer how we can frame the payment function better, how we can do information campaigns around OBF and its incentives better. We just need to understand how to design and implement OBF better, and we're not using the potential of research to do so.
Yep, very good point. Sorry for stealing the time and cutting out some of the questions because I do want to give a chance to our audience to ask a few questions. I think there are some questions coming up from Zoom. So what we will do is take one question from Zoom, one from the room, answer that, and then take another round. Let's do the Zoom question first.
Yeah, definitely. I hope you can all hear me. I'll ask this on behalf of Robbie, who's actually joining us on a train today, which is dedication. This is mainly directed towards Dear. He's interested in the public-private composition of funders behind the Lifted program. I wondered how this coalition came about. For example, did USAID help build confidence and bring the corporate foundations on board?
Okay, thanks. And I think I saw a hand there. Oh, yep. Oh. Yes.
Is that working? Hi, I'm Peter Hinton, fellow at Sci Business School. And my DPhil was on financing of low-cost non-state schools in Africa. And so my question is both various members of the panel. In terms of, I'm familiar with the ECCE initiative with DG Murray Trust in South Africa, where the government is the outcomes payer for early childhood providers. But that's the only example I know. And if we're talking about challenging preconceived notions, I'm interested in what people have to say about how we manage to overcome, well, to address the challenge of getting the government to work with the non-state low-cost school sector, particularly the ECCE level, because they are the majority provider of education in lots of the cities I've looked at, and I know this is true in India, so that we move away to, we bring them on board, the government, in outcomes performance, but bringing the providers, being the low-cost schools, and hold them accountable for quality so that we work together in partnership and collaboration to enhance the quality of education for all children. So that's my question.
Yes. We can go to Dhir first to explain the Lifted, and then Özel, probably you can give your experience on the ECC in other countries. Okay, Dhir, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. We are an implementation partner, so we don't know what really happened and how the corporate sector came to join this particular bond. But we do know that the consortium partners were clear from the beginning that this particular bond will not be funded just by foreign funders. And already corporate sector partners in India were looking for supporting outcome-based funding. As I mentioned to you, the Haryana Impact Bond, which was the first domestically funded impact bond in the country, which we implemented, was supported by 2 banks. So there was already interest in that. And I think the consortium partners, especially led by, BAT as well as MSDF, they were chasing corporate financing from the very beginning. And I think we're really happy that there are Indian corporate funders that are supporting this impact bond. There are 4 implementation partners. And that just goes to show that there is a lot of interest, and there is an opportunity for more impact bonds that are funded by corporate partners in India.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Sietse, with the whole ecosystem building there?
No, I think that's really, yeah, everything I wanted
Okay.
to say,
All
to
right.
be honest.
Ozel, could we come to you about the experience working with governments, especially supporting private sector providers in ACCE?
Very much so. And I can speak to our experience, as you mentioned, in South Africa, but also in Rwanda and Sierra Leone. And I would say yes, in the case of South Africa, a lot of the provision is low-cost private providers or early learning programs. But in several other countries, including in 2 countries that we partner in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, community-based early childhood provision is quite common, and there is more in-kind and maybe less formal fees associated with provision in those cases. So how we work with the governments to use kind of the potential of outcomes-based financing in these 2 different models is, in the case of South Africa, you might be familiar with the research training organizations. There's a very rich ecosystem of research training organizations that already support early learning programs. So the outcomes fund there will be incentivizing these research training organizations and their support to the early learning programs for quality improvement in their services. So there could be increased impact on child development outcomes for the children who are attending those centers. So there, the model is kind of a 2-tiered, not directly to the providers, but to those intermediary organizations who are already in the ecosystem with the mandate to be supporting on the ground smaller, low-cost early childhood programs. In the case of Sierra Leone and Rwanda, it's a bit trickier. They're community-based organizations in remote rural areas that the government would like to support. Ultimately, in both scenarios, in both setups, we're looking at government trying to find ways to strengthen its own regulatory capabilities in this particular subsector. And in this case, where the grantees of the outcomes fund is actually larger NGOs who are then have the objective to work with community-based or early childhood providers to build capabilities and to improve quality towards better child development outcomes. So that's the setup with 2 different types of providers across the 3 countries.
And as far as I know, the expressions of interest for all 3 programs in South Africa, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone are open at the moment. So all that selection process is going on. Can I steal 5 more minutes from lunchtime to take 2 more questions? Okay. All right. So 1 more question from Zoom and then back there.
I was wondering if Stephen would like to unmute from Award Canada. He's launched quite a good discussion. If not, I can ask it.
Probably go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
So I think the discussion came from 2 parts. The original question really, so it was 4 a.m. in the morning when I got up, so I look a bit of a sight. The original question was really about the unintended consequences of OBF, and really that sort of led to one that we're facing here, which was based on the answer from Royal Shakespeare Company about, not only the things that they were, the impacts and the outcomes that they were looking for, but also how those outcomes and impacts prove that using their model is better than somebody else's model. And the theories of change that were being put forward were great, but actually it's not just about showing that you've got a good theory of change that has some impact. It's also in this day and age about showing that your solution is better than somebody else's not-for-profit or whatever it might be provider solution. And I think that's both. I mean, John came back and said there's an element of scale, but I think it's also one of scope. That education as a whole tends to be fairly narrowly defined in our experience here in Canada. It's all about the curriculum at the secondary school level in particular. And I think, we're finding that to try and challenge that and get them talking about wider employability and skills for employment in later life is actually very difficult. And so again, unintended consequences are, for us, that big one is how do you get them to focus on something wider, because outcomes based is really focusing them on what they think of now. But I wondered if there were other things that the panel thought about.
Okay, thank you. Oh, question back there.
Hello, I'm Sam Magny from the National Lottery Community Fund. We heard a lot in the contributions from the panel today about rigor and robustness of measurement, and congratulations to all of you who have managed to factor in quasi-experimental tests into the payment mechanism, which is often not the case in many SIBs. So I'm really interested to sort of hear more about how the use of that kind of rigor in the payment mechanism with your test of attribution and has been important as part of a theory of influence. I think we heard earlier Thea saying that the impact of the SIB was in fact to convince people to scale out a model of intervention rather than the model of the contracting across a state. So are we really talking here about using these really robust tests of causality as a theory of influence? What happens when you end up with a situation whereby the state decides to have such a large coverage that, as happened with the world's first SIB, that your counterfactual is killed? And does that matter, or does that just show that you have succeeded in terms of your theory of influence? And I'm also interested to know if it's all about a theory of influence in order to just facilitate a process whereby people end up funding an intervention model that everyone thinks is a great idea, then is it really important actually to find the type of payment and contracting mechanism that is going to be as close as possible to what would then follow? And I was really interested to hear about.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
So here's the nub of the question. With Thea talking about what sounded to me like a social impact guarantee rather than a social impact bond, what are his thoughts in particular, therefore, about the value of using a SIG, which allows the commissioners to commission on a basis that is closer to what they would do normally than using a SIB?
So dear Osel and Vikas, if you want to answer those questions, could you just raise your hand and I can call on you? Okay, not yet. Anyone from here? There are two very, oh, sorry, Osel, please go ahead.
Just on the unintended consequences of using outcomes-based financing and the measurement piece in relation to that, 100% agree. And I think it's very critical, as fellow panelists also said, to start with existing measures and metrics that are already in place and to build on them and to make sure that I think the closer we can come to outcomes that are for the program participants and further away from proxies to those outcomes, I think hopefully the less likely we are to create these unintended consequences, especially with early childhood care and education, for example, when we're talking about holistic child development outcomes. I think it's I think by focusing further down the line of the outcomes change towards what matters for the program participants, and also with starting with the kind of measures that already resonate or in place with the government, we're able to mitigate to a large extent a lot of those unintended consequences, and also to partner with mission-driven organizations. I think ultimately coming back to trust once again.
Yep. Any yours? Please go ahead, Sietse.
Yeah, I think coming back to that, I think around the unintended consequences, but also just taking a step back, I think shifting from an input activity to outcomes, I think the key thing there is this is really a cultural change. It's a change of continuous improvement. It's trying to test things quickly, see if they work and move on. And it could very well be that there are indeed unintended consequences, then adapt, move on, and keep making yourself better. But I think that shouldn't be an excuse to say, okay, OBF doesn't work. I think that whole cultural change of shifting to results, shifting to outcomes, that's the important bit, with that kind of like change mindset attached to it, rather than just sometimes you hear the conversation is wanting to throw it out because of some of the things that are being mentioned.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to end right there, but just to let everyone know, some of these publications that Osel mentioned will be coming out very soon. So look out on GoLab's page, NORAC's page, and Education Outcomes Fund and EFN's page. They will be all there. In the meantime, in the next few days, there will be a highlight written up about this session, and we will link up a lot of the resources in there. So please look out for that as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope you keep continuing the conversation during the break. Okay.